While I was changing upstairs, I snuck off and did a little email, and somebody from Colombia said, we want to do a pilot program to test this to see if it'll work in Colombia. And my answer was, rubbish, just go to Uruguay. You don't need to do a pilot. The point is that many countries look at Uruguay, and for that reason, I'm really very happy to be here. So I'm going to start with, where do new ideas come from? And I'm going to give you my version. We all have our own, but the key to me, and I'll just give you 5 of them, is differences. And it's interesting that most of us grow up in environments, families, education systems, cultures, where differences are not celebrated. They're things that you want to get rid of. And in fact, one of the hardest things to tell a teacher, or to in fact persuade a student, is that there isn't one answer. There are in fact different answers. And differences of age, culture, perspective create all sorts of new ideas. Sometimes even a misunderstanding is the birthplace of an idea. The second thing about innovation that I feel very strongly about is that incrementalism is your enemy. That if you just treat things incrementally, that's all that will happen. Now, there are certain fields. Let me take the semiconductor industry, where there's a natural tendency to incrementally do something, to lower the line widths, to do this, to shrink sizes. But incrementalism is in fact not good, but is something you want to encourage people not to do if you're going to look for innovation and bold ideas. And the third is really hard, because discipline is usually a bedfellow with education. And we think of discipline as something like sports exercise, and that you have to do it, and that maybe even singing a song in class, or reciting, or memorizing is an activity for the mind like athletics is for the body. And I think there is some truth to it, but not that much. And that, in fact, discipline is often, again, not necessarily good. And when I say perspective in innovation is worth a lot more than IQ, I think this is very true. I had, as a student, at a very young age, the chance to participate in a wild goose chase all across Switzerland. This was pretty special. You're 12 years old and you have a 5-day wild goose chase across the nation. And we were all on our own, as actually teams of 4 people. And the people who won the wild goose chase weren't the smart kids in the class. They were the street smart kids in the class. And I ran one of these for my son when he was that age. I didn't have all of the United States or Switzerland or Greece to use, but I just used Boston. And I couldn't persuade the other parents to let the children do this for 4 or 5 days. But there were all sorts of little quizzes and games, and one of them was a crossword puzzle with dates. And if you figured out the dates, they lined up the bottom digits, made a phone number that you should call to get your next clue. And all the smart kids went off to the library and went off and called people to ask for the answers and tried to do it with reference books. And the street smart kids knew they had to go from one place to the other place, and on the subway engaged all the people on the subway, asking them if they knew the answers, and got the whole subway car participating in the answers to that question. And of course they won the game. And so it's very important to look at things from a different point of view, and it's something that's very, very hard to do. And the last is culture, and it's so important. I'll just bore you with one more text slide. And the culture has several pieces, but one of them, which is a reason perhaps why Uruguay is the first country, is to not be too big. Big is a very interesting phenomenon. Let me give you an example from the corporate world. Outside of MIT, and partly because of OLPC, I'm very involved with big companies, in fact, always have been. a big company is that 50% of the people in the big company manage the other 50% of the people. And the 50% of the people being managed spend 50% of their time being managed. So that means that you're starting off with a net energy of 25%. Because half are managing, half of the others are spending their time being managed. Whereas in a small company, everybody kind of does everything, and management is more like a jazz group rather than an orchestra. And so it works. And the same applies to a country. You'll see later that we had initially started 1 laptop per child with 5 and eventually 6 big countries. And in the end, none of those countries participated. It was Uruguay, followed by other smaller countries. Being heterogeneous is also a very important part of a culture. And that heterogeneity can be a mixture of Europeans, natives, locals, it can also be a country like the United States where people come from many different places. It's very, very important. And again, a corporate analogy is that if people in a particular discipline who tend mostly to look inward inside a company were to go out to, let's say, a conference, it is typically a conference of their peers, a conference that is of their specialty. If they're travel agents, it'll be a conference of travel agents. If they're, throat doctors, it'll be a conference of throat doctors. A conference like this one is, in fact, a good example of where the heterogeneity of, let's say, those of you who are from corporate worlds will meet people from all sorts of backgrounds in this room. A culture that celebrates the nail that sticks up, to use a Japanese expression where they say you should pound it back down again, is again something very important. It is not necessarily celebrated in Asian societies, but it's something very typical, let's say, in the UK, and to a slightly lesser extent, perhaps, in the United States. Stigmatizing failure, cultures that do that, it's a death sentence for innovation. In fact, the former head of the EU asked me, Nicholas, if you could do one thing to change laws in Europe, to make Europe more innovative, what would you do? And he really wanted just one, it was a little quiz. And I said, Romano, I would change the bankruptcy laws. And in some countries in Europe, the bankruptcy laws are so onerous that nobody takes risk, and the failures, in fact, are rare, but the innovation is equally rare. I put the 5th there because many people don't listen to their young. I come from a family that's very European. My parents were extremely European in many ways. Amongst others, spoke multiple languages. Nobody seemed to be able in the family to finish the sentence in the same language. They knew all sorts of things. When my father played Trivial Pursuit, he corrected the cards. And I had just started Wired magazine and written a back-page story on why Europe was so unwired, and I meant uninnovative. And this was a little over 10 years ago. He didn't like the story. And he said to me that he didn't like the story, and I said, well, let's discuss it after dinner. Now you have to realize that, again, it was slightly foreign.